Hello and welcome to Studies in British Literature to 1760. Apologies for the delay with the beginning of this video. As I mentioned, I was on the road for the last couple of days and I'm currently recording this at about 9 o'clock in the evening so there may be some background noise from the house and stuff like that. Hopefully it's not too distracting. I just wanted to briefly cover a couple of topics in relation to the course, and both in terms of the broad coverage of the course and the assignments that we're going to be doing and what sort of purpose that they serve, and also looking at this week's readings briefly, and especially looking at this week's assignment just to clarify any sort of issues that I may be a little bit worried that aren't all that clear from the instructions. So obviously in terms of the course itself, the purpose of it is to cover the development of English satire during the long 18th century and the sort of early modern period after Shakespeare and after Ben Jonson and those sort of major literary figures of a slightly earlier era. You get the emergence of several very high-profile satirists, in particular John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, and others who we aren't necessarily covering because the course is a little short, like Samuel Johnson, but also Aphra Behn and Lady Montagu. And we're going to be looking at how satire evolved during that time. But it's a pretty short course, so we'll only be able to scratch the surface of that development. Really what I want to emphasize in terms of your skill acquisition in this course is your ability to both work closely with others to investigate texts and their meanings, both their historical meanings, but also the sort of textual detail of a particular text. And secondly, to develop your own independent learning and your own critical thinking and critical reading skills in ways that help you become a better literary scholar. So early in the course, the assignments that we're going to be doing will emphasize two things. The first is working closely with your classmates in order to, discover the meaning of a given text and to explore the possible implications of it and the ramifications of what they're saying. And the second thing is to begin acquiring some of the crucial skills for presenting your own ideas and developing your own arguments that we'll start to follow through on later in the course. So this week we're going to be looking at Dryden's work and Shadwell and stuff like that. We'll be doing a discussion forum, but as you may have seen, the structure of the discussion forum is a little different because you're each put into one or other of two groups, and each group is focusing on one text or two texts. And the idea is that you're going to not just work with those people in your group to explicate and work through a text, but also you're going to draw upon your classmates from the other group to learn a little bit more about what that text is doing. And part of the reason for that is to lighten the reading load. Now, you are expected to sort of read through all of the texts in a given week. However, it's understandable that it can become a little overwhelming. So part of what we're going to be doing is working through one another and drawing upon one another's skills in order to get a better feel for the overall landscape of satirical literature in this era without always being overwhelmed by the reading. But the main reason for doing this, aside from sort of lightening the workload, is that I think reading individually is a very rewarding practice, and it can be a great way of exploring the meaning of a text and so on. But we learn more by working with others and by understanding and respecting the perspectives that other people bring to bear on a text. No one of us is likely to provide the same amount of insight into a text as we'll get by working together. And this is something that I've learned is true of literary scholarship all the time. So I really want to foster that as a central part of this course. And we're beginning with that in a traditional discussion form. But next week, you'll build on that by working closely with your classmates on a close reading exercise. Now, that will mean that we are going to, you're going to be in a group again, but you'll work with that group of 3 of you on a particular passage from one of the week's texts. And you'll need to get a good understanding of the contextual material around that and understand where that author is coming from, the same as you would with any text, but the focus is going to be on looking at a very small part of it in considerable amounts of detail and thinking about how the writing of that text changes its meaning, because we have a tendency to look through the text and try and say, well, what beyond all of that language and whatever, what is he really saying? And I want to get away from that and think more about, well, how does the way that this writer says this stuff, how does that shape the meaning? And we're going to work together on that. Again, fostering that sort of community scholarship, but also it's to start thinking about, well, what sort of textual detail can help us to explain and understand a text and argue about it in more detail. So as the weeks go on, that close reading exercise that you do as a group will be followed up by an individual close reading exercise where you do it on your own. But when you do that close reading on your own, you'll build on the skills you built before, but it'll also be building towards your later assignments, which will be sort of, these will be sort of low stakes exercises. As you go on into the later weeks, there'll be a little bit more pressure, and it'll be also scaffolded into wider arguments. So you'll be thinking about close textual reading, and then as you go along, you'll think in more detail about how to relate close reading exercises to broader thematic issues and contextual historical questions and things like that. So week to week, these assignments will build upon one another, and so they're not just arbitrary things. You're not just doing a discussion forum and then forgetting about it. You're laying the groundwork and building the skill sets that you need to work upwards to higher levels of thinking and more complex kinds of assignments. So after having done some of those close reading exercises, we'll then spend a little bit of time doing what I would regard as the other major skill that you need to acquire to begin thinking through your own arguments. That is looking at critical work, other people's scholarship, historical scholarship and criticism and stuff like that, and working through that kind of reading, not just to extract information from it and say, well, now I know this about, say, Dryden, but instead thinking about, well, how can I push back against that? Maybe how can I argue with what that person has said? How can I call into question what they've said? Or how can I build upon what I've read and not just take it as information, right? So close reading on the one side, critical reading of scholarship on the other side. These two skills are what we'll be building over the opening weeks. While we're doing that, you'll also be peer reviewing one another's work. Again, fostering, like with the discussion forum and like with the group exercise, fostering a sense of the value of working with your peers and working with other literary scholars to build your knowledge, and especially to challenge one another to do better. I know you have probably done some peer review exercises in the past, but especially at postgraduate level, it becomes increasingly important to recognize that the work we do is seldom done individually. It's always done as part of a wider scholarly community. So really what we're doing all the way along is building that scholarly community. So as we progress then Into the latter stages of the course, you're going to begin to do your two sort of major assignments. And the major assignments are, on the one hand, you're going to do a presentation, which will hopefully mimic a conference presentation. And the other thing you'll do is a final paper that will mimic a journal article. Okay, so those are the two major ways that literary scholars communicate. So those are the two major ways that we're going to communicate our ideas. So you'll draw upon the work you've done in your critical reviews and in your close reading exercises. In fact, you'll be able to choose your subject from those exercises if you like, at least with the video presentation, and you'll develop a short presentation like you would at a conference, and you'll subject that to the scrutiny of your peers. Again, part of what you'll do is engage in question and answer sessions with one another, just like you would at a literature conference. So again, building those skills, but hopefully allowing those your ideas and your arguments in that presentation to emerge from the work you've done in the more low stakes exercises that we do in the opening few weeks. Okay, and then the last thing we'll do is the final paper, which is obviously it's the culmination of your thinking about satire in the long 18th century. It's also going to be a chance to demonstrate your acquisition of all those skills, particularly close reading skills and critical evaluative skills and broader ability to discuss thematic issues in relation to a text, all of which will have been fostered by what we're doing earlier. So that's the sort of broad logic of what we're trying to do here. So I wanted to talk just briefly. I've already mentioned about the reading. You can see from the list there is quite a lot of reading in a given week, but hopefully the way the assignments are set up will mean that you feel comfortable being able to read some stuff in a more overview kind of way, while delving into much more depth on particular texts. And early on, those will be sort of assigned to different groups, and as we progress, you'll have increasing amounts of freedom to choose your areas of emphasis in a given week. And part of that is because everything else we do in a given week will involve having increasing levels of personal responsibility and personal oversight of your own learning, so that I'll probably be stepping away from what you're learning increasingly as the weeks go on. Okay, so just briefly, I wanted to talk about this week's reading. The main guy we're going to be looking at here is Dryden, one of the great English satirists, has profoundly shaped the way that we think about satire in the English language. And a lot of that is actually rooted in the three texts that we're going to be looking at by him this week. The first one, The Original and Progress of Satire, Discourse on the Original and Progress of Satire, is a sort of detailed historical breakdown of Greek and Roman satire, but it's also an examination of what satire should do and a defense of what its role should be in his era, in the contemporary era, and how that might differ from what purpose it served in Greek and Roman times, where he sort of draws out the benefits of things like Horace's satire and Juvenal's satire, but ultimately what he's talking about is what satire should be for his own era. I don't want to lay out the principles of that right now, mainly because that's your main job this week in the discussion forum, is to begin thinking about, well, what is he saying are the principles of satire here, and what should it do? And then thinking about how we see that playing out, or maybe how we don't see it playing out in some of these major texts. I will say, I know he's long-winded, very long-winded. I would even go so far as to say the first 10 or 15 pages of The Original and Progress of Satire may not really be necessary, and that you'll find that that's often the case with some of these guys. I think once we get to Swift is a bit more to the point and direct about what his meaning is, but try and bear with it and it will yield fruit, I think. The longest text of his that we're looking at, the longest poetic text of his is Absalom and Achitophel, which uses a biblical story of David and Absalom as an allegory for the succession crisis of King Charles II. So he's using that story kind of like, say, Orwell uses Animal Farm or something like that, as a way of telling one story in order to make a point about his own contemporary era. In it, he is defending King Charles II's right to pass on succession of the throne to James, who was much feared in England because he was Catholic. And Dryden himself was not a Catholic, but his point is that the succession of the monarchy needs to be kept intact, and it was very strictly laid out, still is very strictly laid out, who succeeds to the throne. In Dryden's era, there was great anxiety about the possibility that if you break that succession, the stability of the country is under threat. And this is a fundamental point about the monarchy, is that there's a fear that if you begin making sort of democratic decisions about who should be king, then you start to destabilize the nation, that it will become subject to the beliefs of the rabble or the populace, and this is not regarded as a good thing at all. So it's a defense in some ways, this poem, of the idea of the divine right of succession in monarchy. And so what he's satirizing is not necessarily the figure of Absalom, but those who may be pushing Absalom to try and take over from King David. And this is a way of not criticizing royal figures in his own time, but it's also a way of identifying what he regards are the values that the monarchy stands for, and what are the vices that the enemies of the legitimate monarchy stand for. And part of your role in this week is identifying, well, what moral values is he trying to uphold in this poem, and what vices is he trying to criticize? Okay, and how does he go about doing that? Right. In some ways, I think Dryden may be a particularly conservative figure here, because he's, we tend to think of satire as being directed against state power and against powerful people. Now, he is talking about quite powerful people, but ultimately he is defending the integrity of the state and the monarchy. Very difficult to directly challenge the monarchy. In fact, nobody ever really challenges the monarchy directly. It'd be a good way of landing yourself in some trouble. But he is particularly conservative in comparison with the much more radical critiques that we might see later down the road. The other group in the discussion forum will be dealing with Macflecknoe and the Medal of John Bayes. Macflecknoe is a satire by Dryden of Shadwell, and it's a sort of personal attack on Shadwell and his stupidity as Dryden sees it. But what I'm wondering is, because Dryden regards satire as something that by necessity has to go beyond just personally insulting people, what is he satirizing here? What moral values does this uphold? And again, like with Absalom and Achitophel, what does it attack? Does it rise above personal insult, as satire should? And that's the question that I would like you to answer. Similarly, Shadwell, who's not as good of a poet as Dryden, he writes a response to Macflecknoe called the Medal of John Bayes, where he basically uses John Bayes as a stand-in for Dryden, and he throws loads of horrifically scurrilous insults at Dryden. It is quite funny how explicit some of this stuff can get. This is nothing compared with Rochester, who we'll be looking at next week, but who's capable of much more scandalous accusations and much more sort of vulgar language too. But again, I'm interested in how they go beyond just the personal insults. Personal insults are interesting and they're funny. Some of them have stood the test of time pretty well, but what I'm interested in is to what extent do they go beyond that? And how do these guys measure up to the expectations of satire, the formal textual expectations and the moral expectations that are laid down in Dryden's Original and Progress? Okay, so this week's assignment, you're going to be working together on this. I've sort of already laid out what I see as the reasons for doing this assignment. It's essentially to get used, first of all, to working together on a text, rather than thinking of yourself as an individual who's sort of doing an online course and reading all of these obscure 17th century texts all on your own. You're very much part of a community here, and it's a matter of learning to work together to get a better understanding of that. So the importance of collaborating is very central to this. And that will inform the grading. So I'll give you a full rubric on this tomorrow, but essentially it will be a fairly low stakes assignment. Your grade for it will be given partly on sort of honesty of effort, that you're definitely showing that you've engaged with the text. It doesn't mean that you have to have understood it. If there's parts of it you didn't understand, it is necessary that you be like, okay, I didn't get that. Somebody help me out. It's absolutely fine to do that. I really want to encourage people to do that, because that's obviously how we learn, and I don't want you to feel that you lose grade points by admitting that there's parts of it you didn't get, okay? But really the emphasis will be on that you have a clear understanding of what your role is in your group. So you each have to be assigned a role within the group. One person is a respondent, one person is a summarizer, etc. Also, that you constructively engage with your partners and the other classmates, that you show a willingness to support one another, to build upon one another's ideas, and especially to challenge one another, to be willing to disagree respectfully and constructively with your classmates. That is the sign of a group that are working well together and that trust one another to help each other out. Okay, so it's not competitive. Your grade is not dependent on your ability to do better than other people in your class. It is all about working together. But the other thing is that you're willing to build upon what people say. You don't have to be disagreeing all the time, but you definitely don't want to just blithely agree with one another. So the main thing is that in week one, I also want to get beyond the idea of thinking about the text just as an open conversation or talking about just your personal feelings about the text, but to begin engaging in an analysis that draws upon ideas about satire that were current at the time, and scholarship on it, and thinking actively about how these texts might engage with those notions of satire. I haven't specifically included anything about the scholarly readings, Griffin and Combe and those things, and Marshall, which are all available to you in the course module. But you should read those things in order to get a better understanding of what kind of historical context this stuff was being written in, and what sort of thoughts people have had about these texts as well. So try and spend a bit of time with that, especially if you're finding that you're struggling to understand what Dryden or Shadwell are really talking about. I do want to emphasize also that I'm here to help. That's why I'm here. And if you have any questions, you can always email me. You're always welcome to get in touch with like any suggestions you have or any questions and stuff like that. But I do want to push you to get used to the idea of relying on one another for ideas as well, rather than seeing me as a sort of fount of knowledge. That's why I've built this assignment the way that I have, that you're going to be helping your classmates to understand this text, and working with one another and questioning one another and stuff like that, because I think ultimately that will serve you as more valuable than just asking me a question about, well, what does this mean? And I tell you, that's not really as useful as building an intellectual community, which is the necessary first step, I think, in this course before you can get into the more complicated task of developing your own arguments and so on, because those arguments and those ideas that you have about these texts will emerge from the conversations you have with one another. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to working with all you guys. I'm really excited about this. I will be reading the discussion forum during the week. I'll be reading the intros probably tomorrow morning. I'm a bit tired right now, and I can't wait to see how you guys are getting on. I'll be talking to you directly in the discussion forum during the week. So have fun reading. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys write, and chat soon. And sorry about the dark light. I just noticed how dark the screen is. I'll talk to you during the week. Bye bye.